John, I'm aware that Holly Graf ended her career with an honorable discharge after being relieved of command for cruelty. Couple of questions I wanted to ask about that. What exactly does that say about the system? How could that have happened? And was she protected in some way?
Yeah, good question. It's a really interesting, especially to someone outside the Navy, is, in most organizations, when you're fired from the company, right? And your pay stops and you go somewhere else. In the Navy, if you are fired or relieved from a command, you're still in the Navy, right? And so it's one of those, there's sort of two pieces to it. On the one side, there is a selection process for a job that many people never get. And so to fail at that, it doesn't always mean that you're a poor naval officer. I've had friends who've been relieved from command for a collision, perhaps a DUI, and that doesn't wipe out 20 years, 25 years of service and good leadership if you make a mistake on one day, which is different than this. But it all goes through the same process. And so after the relief of command, there's usually a longer investigation. It may take months to sort of put all the pieces together with a recommendation. And then once that's bought off on, then that officer becomes sort of back in the pool, unless the Navy decides that their sins were egregious enough to do what's called a show cause, where that officer has to present to a set of peers that their service is worthy of being retained in the Navy, and also not being downgraded to a lower pay grade, which is a possibility when they retire. So not being privy to how that played out in this case, I can't tell you whether there was protection. Typically, an officer can find someone who can testify on their behalf that they were, did great things, and typically there is a sense of, was it punishment enough maybe to take away the command, especially so publicly, so not having been a part of that process, I can't speak to the whole thing, but it is sort of apples and oranges, unless Kirk and Nicole have any other thoughts.
Yeah, so to my understanding, when she was relieved of command from the Cowpens, she, at some point, I don't know how the time frame afterwards, but she went to a board of inquiry with 3 flag officers, and they were to determine, to make a recommendation at what pay grade she should be retired at, and whether it be an honorable discharge or not. I provided actually testimony to that board of inquiry, and I'm aware, to my recollection, that the board recommended that she be retired as an 06 with an other than honorable, or actually I think it was a general discharge, and I'm not positive on that. It wasn't an honorable discharge. And it went all the way to the Secretary of the Navy, who actually changed it to an honorable discharge.
Okay. And just to be clear, there's honorable, which is most people get. There is general, which kind of means something wasn't right. And then there's other than honorable, which is, actually involves a loss of some benefits, and it's almost a punishment. And it's typically reserved for those who have been convicted of something at captain's mast or admiral's mast.
Right. So this case is something like 20 years ago or so now?
Yeah.
Was there more ambivalence at that time to publicly come out and say, we've made a mistake, we've got to not have an honorable discharge? Would it still play out the same way today?
Hard to say.
I can't speak to that.
I just think also, and please, John and Kirk, correct me if I'm wrong, but my sense was always too that sort of a cultural thing within naval officers versus maybe the punishments that an enlisted person might get for offenses. And I think that culturally, I think that officers are given the benefit of the doubt and not, maybe for lack of a better word, punished as severely. Now, that's my sense, and if I'm wrong on that, please tell me, but just through history, the sort of the design of the whole system where you have an officer community and enlisted community.
Right. I would probably agree with that. I mean, it's all anecdotal, but I've testified at 2 or 3 of these boards, and at least in my small microcosm, the officers have come out better than the enlisted, with what I would consider equal testimony coming in and sort of an equal level of offense. And so I don't think that's, you have a hard time proving it or disproving it, but you're probably not too far off base, Nicole.
I'm interested in the idea if this is a subject that's ever dealt with successfully by the Navy, and if there has been improvement in the last 20 years, maybe the way that particular topic was dealt with at that time would not be the way it would be dealt with today. Has this changed at all, or is this still something that you feel like the Navy is totally blind to?
Toxic leadership, meaning?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. I can only speak to the negative. I don't know of a single case where an officer has been relieved for this and then subsequently punished and downgraded. But that doesn't mean they don't exist. I know that Dr. Michael Young wrote a book called Crimes of Command that sort of gets into this with some case studies. But, and I've been fairly tuned in and can't recall a single episode. I guess that could mean everything from the Navy is blind to it. It could mean that it hasn't happened again. I think the answer is probably somewhere in the middle, unless Kirk or Nicole has knowledge.
Well, one thing I was reminded of as you were speaking, John, is you said, that someone had told you of they had encountered a similar style of leadership when she was in the Navy, I believe. So I'm just thinking that there are a lot of these incidences that go undocumented officially, maybe. I mean, I can think of other naval officers I served under that were just as toxic, maybe for different reasons. We had, I mentioned before, we had another department head on our ship, and the effect that had on a real bright junior officer who was a peer of mine. And, and in that case, that person rose to be considered for admiral and had command positions. And I don't think that kind of story is uncommon, is my sense of just talking to people and having, when I was in. So I think that this is a very important issue that, it needs to be addressed and talked about within the Navy, and why this happens and what culturally is contributing to it. And I feel that it's very common in the SWO community,
Right. Well, I think that's where the article and the discussion was intended to go, was sort of, okay, what could be put in place? How do you know, and how would you be able to know? Because even today, a lot of it occurs inside the lifelines of the ship, and some of those cultural things that they talk about are very true today. I think the three of us have talked extensively about, what are some fire breaks? What are some policies that could be put in place that might, on the one hand, be fair to people who maybe are tough leaders, but also identify those who maybe shouldn't go on to higher positions.
Mm-hmm. And again, I think that's the toxic leadership. I mean, the officers out there who are toxic, I definitely know that it's a minority. I mean, in my personal experience, I served 10 years at sea on 4 ships. And of all the XOs and COs that I worked for, definitely Commander Graf was the most toxic. But there was no other officer that I served with that was even close to that. I had every CO and XO I had was actually very good. There was my very first CO was very demanding, but he was consistent. I mean, he wasn't toxic. He was just very demanding and somewhat of a micromanager, but he was still actually a good captain of the ship. I mean, he had great ship handling and all that. I would not consider him toxic. So this is, we're not definitely, and I think John and Nicole would agree, we're not saying most officers are toxic. It is a very
No.
small minority, very small.
Absolutely, absolutely. But it's one of those words, and not to take the conversation off the rails here, but there's been a lot of discussion about racism in the Navy, right? And so there's another word that evokes different levels of meaning. But it's different to say that there is racism or there is toxic leaders than to say he is a racist or she is a toxic leader. That becomes a whole different discussion. And so, one of my friends who's been following some of the discussions now has noted that although there seems to be broad agreement that there are some racial issues in the Navy, no one's really been sort of taken to task for it. And so along those lines, it's very much, some of it is in the eye of the subordinate or the peers or the superiors, and could have very different definitions of what is it to be a toxic leadership. What's the line between a tough but fair leader and a toxic leader? And I think that would be the hard thing about this, is to put a little more black and white definition to it.
At the beginning of this discussion, it seemed like you were defining it more as what's the effect that you can see? What's the visible effect of a
Right.
toxic leader? How are the people responding in unhealthy manners that might lead you to think that the leader is toxic? Are there psychological characteristics that a toxic leader has that you can name? Are there characteristics, personality traits?
I think, not being mental professional, I think that's probably tough for us to answer. I certainly have opinions about Commander Graf because that's really the only toxic leader I work for. And I do have opinions about her psychological stability on things, but, I'm not a professional, so it would only be my opinion.
Right.
Nicole and I were talking about this last week. We kind of went through both of your writings, as many as we had, and also kind of our own personal experience. We came up with a couple of traits. Let me bounce those off of you, and if you think these fit with the idea of a toxic leader. So the cruelty and maltreatment are par for the course.
In my experience, yes.
There's an environment of fear and hostility created.
Yes.
Yeah.
They're often incompetent.
Now, for me, I only have one example that I can really talk about, and I would agree in that particular example. Yes.
Yeah. Maybe insecure in their competence is another way to say it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Abusive.
Yes.
Lacking emotional intelligence or social intelligence.
Definitely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one
Makes
other, I'm sorry, John, go ahead.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, one other thing that comes to mind is the Navy has, has spent so much, obviously, investment in defining what is leadership, what's positive leadership, what's positive management. And one way is to just take those tenets of each of those categories. It could be even something as a leader or a good leader or a good manager establishes clear goals that subordinates can understand, and and establishes realistic expectations that could be met. I mean, it can go, there's a broader list that Jim just spoke about. And then I think that you could take some of the leadership traits and management traits that the Navy values and sort of, go from there and think how those are violated.
Okay. Or maybe more clearly define, spend as much energy on defining the negative traits and activities as we do the positive ones.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would
Okay.
also add a couple traits.
I have no issue with those. I'm sorry, Kurt.
No, I would add unreasonable. That's definitely one. And,
Yes.
I had another thought. Well, we brought up, I like your definition or your comment, John, about the incompetence. That was good. Yeah, it slipped my mind, the other trait I was thinking of.
Mhm.
I think the emotional intelligence is the one that resonated with me, you know, empathy, lacking of empathy.
Yes.
Which
And,
again is opposite of what we often put as an attribute of good leaders, right?
Mhm.
and the other term I was thinking of was selfish.
Mhm.
Sure.
Yes.
Maybe focus on a career and how the ship looks to the outside, as opposed to or how they look as the CEO.
Right.
And but you know, just to be fair, so I've had command twice, and there are times when you do feel like you're being judged by the ship's performance, and that you're competing with other. You know, the Navy's very competitive, and you know, and again, you know, in my private sector, I was evaluated, but I wasn't ranked. At least not, you know, you're better than him, and she's better than her.
Yes.
And only of you know, for instance, of O5 commands, probably only 2 of the 5 are going to go on to O6 command, and so there's definitely a even for the most positive and you know, encouraging leaders, at some point most of us have a tendency to sort of pull into ourselves and make sure that only the stuff that looks good goes out. And if something that makes somebody else look bad happens to happen, then you know, you kind of look the other way. You know, heat on you is heat off of me, right?
Mhm.
And so I will never say that I didn't, you know, engage in some of that behavior, because I can think of some examples where I did.
That might be another trait, a lack of insight on the part of a toxic leader. I mean, you're talking about having insight is a positive thing and helps in your leadership ability.
Right, right. But also that it's not maybe just a black and white on and off thing. I mean, there are
Yes.
elements, I think, of good and bad leadership in everybody. I think I was a much different commanding officer as an O6 than I was as an O5. You know, a lot of my insecurities had sort of been worked through, and there was less pressure to perform um, in that particular situation because I was more confident. You know, um, so yeah. But no, I
Just,
think because those are go ahead.
no, please, go ahead, John.
No, I think that that's a good sort of, you know, segue into, you know, what could be done about it to try to recognize those traits. And you know, the Navy has done some things in the past. They've done what they call 360 evaluations, where they get evaluations from peers and subordinates. That's kind of come and gone. I'm not sure if it's still in place now. But as I recall, when I did it, you know, I got to pick the people that would evaluate me, and so that's a bit that was a bit you know, you know, self-determining. Um, and I think you know, Nicole and Kirk had come up with some ideas that you know, how would we a recognize these traits, and then what mechanisms could be put in place, changed to address them.
Um, in your writing, you've written kind of a long list of, I guess the ideas, things you think could be in place to identify this kind of situation earlier. Once it's identified, then what do you do? That's another problem. But as
Right.
far as getting the Navy to, I don't know, incorporate some of these ideas, kind of how do you do that? And could I read through this list, and you might want to talk about some of these?
Okay, sure. Maybe just the overall, the, you know, the
Yes,
titles, and then we can, and yeah,
yes.
sure.
So leverage peers, pulse the CMC, a mentoring program, be intrusive, be transparent, educate chaplains, having some kind of hotline, expanding awareness, publishing a book of stories of toxic leadership to get this out there, DECOS. I'm sorry, I've forgotten what that is.
Oh, that's a command climate survey where they survey the crew.
Okay. Senior leadership, fit reps, have books about toxic leadership on the CNO required reading list, and mandatory annual training for officers and CPOs, which includes how to identify and report toxic leadership. Are there any of these that you want to talk about in more detail, or?
I have a couple, and then I'll maybe see what Kirk and Nicole think. But I guess for me, it kind of falls into three categories. One is defining the problem, and that gets into the education and maybe getting some folks together to kind of literally write out what are these traits, what are these attributes that we're looking for, and so that's an education piece. Like help folks define what a toxic leader is so that they recognize it. And secondly, I would say there has to be some sort of engagement at the peer and subordinate level, because that's the only people that can really attest. So they have to be trained to recognize it, but they also have to be asked. And that's where I think the idea of a more intrusive or active, whether it's a survey of hey, these are the traits of a toxic leader, as Nicole talked about, the environment of fear, abuse, things like that. Are you seeing these things? And then get that fed up to act on it. And then finally, what are the touch points in a career where a decision has to be made before that person moves on? They have to get over a hurdle to be selected for the next level. So that if there are questions, like in this case at the 05 level, how do we deal with those head on? Because as you all probably know, in selection boards, the only thing that can be presented are factual documents that have been also endorsed by the person who's being looked at. So I can't just go to Kirk's command selection board and put in a piece of paper that says he's a toxic leader. There has to be a documented evidence, and he has to be able to see it before it goes before the board. So there would have to be something in place when there was smoke, when there was evidence, when there was sort of feeling, to independently assess it, and maybe outside the chain of command, because again, whoever's in charge of deciding could be biased by that officer's performance or that command master chief's performance. And it's kind of the old joke where ship A and ship B have they look at the re-enlistment rates, and ship A is much higher than ship B. So they say, well, ship A must be a great leader. Well, they realize that the sailors are re-enlisting to get off the ship, right? So what are the metrics that you could use to identify someone where you need to dig deeper and maybe ask more of their peers, more of their subordinates who've worked for them, which is all, it's easy to figure out who that is, and ask them those hard questions, Those are the kind of the actionable things that I think are kind of out there.
Yeah, I really concur with what John said. I think education is the key. I think in commissioning programs, ROTC, Naval Academy, OCS, there needs to be some discussion and study of examples of toxic leadership, whether it be Nicole's book or other examples. And with the case with Commander Graf, when that came up, that made national news. It was in Navy Times. It was in Time Magazine. And I remember I had a friend, a neighbor here that was a midshipman at the Naval Academy a few years ago, and they were reading about Holly Graf, and they were, in the Time article, my name was quote. I had a quote of mine in this Time article because I was contacted by Time, and he contacted me and said, "Hey, I read your name, in Time Magazine." And just the point I'm trying to make is they were learning about this particular example, obviously on what not to do. So education is key, but not only officers, but in the chief's mess as well. And I really think the 360 review, I don't know how, if it exists in the fleet today or not, or how it works. I never dealt with it personally in my active duty experience. But it makes a lot of sense, before someone gets selected to be an XO, go back to the division officers that former department head worked for, and go to the CO and XO, and go to their peers and get information. And I think with some type of, a questionnaire or something, I would think that the true story is going to come out or something close to it. And again, when they go up to CO, reach out to the department heads that XO worked for. Go to the other ship XOs and COs. What was the reputation of the ship? And if things do pop up, if it's one thing, it could be just an outlier, or it could be a disgruntled sailor. But if there's multiple, I think it needs to be looked at. And I think that could go a long way with preventing these toxic leaders moving forward.
Yes, and I think in general too, it also just needs to be in the air, established at the top, that this sort of leadership is just not tolerated and not acceptable. When I got out of the Navy and then worked in industry, I worked for a large corporation that had tens of thousands of employees. And it was just known that this sort of behavior wouldn't be tolerated. You just couldn't behave this way. And if you did, you wouldn't be working there anymore. And I know, it's more complicated in the military. It's not as cut and dried entering and leaving, but just culturally in the air, people just have to know that this sort of behavior is not acceptable.
No, that's a great point. Kirk, back to something you said, who's looking at this? Is it the random person who does an investigation, or is it someone who's actually been through some training and some experience and can sort of back away from the problem and say, okay, I've looked at, I've studied it, and I can make a professional assessment, right? And part of that goes to a point that you didn't bring up, but you wrote about, is, you said you talked to chaplains and doctors who saw the signs of this behavior and the results of this behavior, right. But either weren't willing or weren't able or weren't prepared to put that picture together and take it up some other chain to leadership. It's almost like the doctor who has the kid that comes in with a broken arm, and the kid says, well, I fell. Mm-hmm. They came in 2 weeks later with another broken arm. I fell again. At some point you kind of go, maybe that's not the real story. And so maybe the caregivers, the chaplains, the doctors, the corpsmen, we are making some changes. The Navy is putting a lot of effort into the whole mental health piece, including educating leaders. So this could be a part of that. Is how do you see this behavior in yourself if you're getting to that point where there's been other instances of captains who have basically left command in the middle of their tour because they got so stressed out that they broke, right? And so how do you get to the left of that? How do you recognize that? Whether it's the operational stress control, whether it's mental health evaluation, we have a physical evaluation annually. Why can't there be a mental evaluation to make sure that you're healthy, right? And that could catch someone where, some of the things that they say could alert the caregiver. So I think those are some outside entities that could be brought into the equation and trained properly to sort of sound the alarm. And again, if you catch it soon enough, then, that individual gets taken off the track. And maybe they're in a staff position where they can still be in the Navy, but they're not, they don't have that level of control over people's lives, right? But Nicole, it's funny, when I left the Navy and went to private industry, the two things that really struck me right away, like from day one, the facilities were much nicer. And number two, people were just nice to each other, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I went years without hearing a cuss word in the office, and it was just a different environment. And so I think it gets to that cultural piece where what do we value? And some people will say, well, how do you feel? That's not the most important thing. But in some ways it kind of is, if you want somebody to perform, they have to want to come to work. I have a friend who's retiring now, mainly because he says, I don't want to work for my boss anymore. I'm not leaving the Navy, I'm leaving my boss. And, that's a pretty powerful statement.
Yes.
But so how many other people feel that way about that boss, and how did he get in that position? So back to the civilian, maybe there's some things we could learn from the corporate world of how to identify this and just not accept it.
Mhm.
I think another area for education is to not only be able to identify toxic leadership. As John said, of course, you have to have a definition for it. There could be more than one, but identify what's the impact of a toxic leader.
Yes.
Yeah, it's going to hurt people. Definitely does that, but it could kill sailors. A toxic leader, because looking back on our time on board the ship with Nicole, people had an attitude because morale was so low. They didn't want to be there. I didn't want to be there. I mean, when I got there, I wanted to be there, but all I wanted to do was not wake up and face the day because it was going to be painful. And sailors and officers, I mean, they really developed I don't care what happens, and so you get complacency with safety. And fortunately, during our time, no one was killed, but it was certainly possible. I'm sure there was definitely a higher risk.
Yeah.
So I think you have to.
It's a dangerous climate.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right.
And, people don't want to give their best for a leader who's going to degrade them. They don't want to do their best.
Absolutely.
Right.
'Cause
Or they don't want to speak up.
Right.
They
Exactly.
certainly don't want to show weakness. That's Jim, you mentioned my look at fatigue. One of the things that's important, the culture of where fatigue is, mitigation is important. Is first of all to recognize it, but secondly to speak up, and that might mean admitting that you are tired, or admitting that you're too tired, or not prepared, or not qualified, or not ready to do this evolution. Well, if that means you're going to get crushed, you might just try to gut it out. And again, as Kirk said, that can lead to a dangerous situation.
Absolutely.
But then on a personal note, just being personally degraded constantly, I mean, daily for 18 months, I mean, that gets to you. I mean, I felt like I was a pretty strong person. Again, the yelling part, I mean, didn't bother me directly. I mean, I did a plebe year at the Naval Academy, so I was yelled at for a year. I mean, I could face someone yelling at me, but the constant degradation and, even though she never actually put her hands around my neck and physically abused me, I mean, she'd throw things at you and just be very difficult to get work done, just daily routine work. And that's just like, why should I even bother anymore? And then of course that affects the operations of the ship. And it just really messed up my, personally, I speak for me, it messed up my attitude about doing my best and doing, the right things for the ship.
Yes.
No, there's definitely a long-term effect. And, to nowadays, one of the differences is that XOCO tour is all one tour. So the officer starts out, does 18 months as an executive officer, and then straight on to commanding officer. So there's no gap in between to kind of insert a check and balance into there. It's really dependent upon, the commanding officer of that executive officer to kind of make that assessment. And in Kirk's case, it doesn't sound like that individual was willing to take it to that level and make that tough call.
And then another thing is, from my perspective as a senior watch officer, the senior department head, I was responsible for training the junior officers. And, many of the junior officers like Nicole, I mean, this was their first ship, their first command in the Navy. For me personally, I had 2 great division officer tours. I'm on 2 great ships. I mean, it was fantastic. It was very rewarding. And I remember more than once talking to the junior officer saying, this is not the Navy. The Navy is different than this. This is very unique. Please, try to understand that, other people are having better experiences. We're in a bad situation here, but don't, try not to base your opinion on your future career based on this experience. And so we had at least 3 of the junior officers that did go on to command. 2 of them made 06, 1 made 05, but 3 had commands of ships. And I was glad to see that because all 3 of them struggled. I remember talking to all of them And one of them was actually a second tour divo, but the other two, this was their first ship. And I just felt so bad for them that they didn't get to experience what I got to experience in my first two tours.
Right.
And I was afraid that, you know, and these were really good people, good officers, good leaders. And so, you know, I wanted to see them succeed in the Navy for my Navy. And fortunately, in those three individuals, they did go on and, you know, got by that.